Meeting for those who weren't able to come. Okay, we should all be back. I hope some good things went on in your breakout rooms. So let's just take some time to work through the different rooms. So let's start with room one with Thea, Justin, Mac, uh, Nehemiah, and Sadie. Maybe one of you would like to volunteer to share something that you guys talked about.
We kind of just talked generally about how there's art in pretty much everything. Like any form of expression could be artful, whether it's intentional or not.
Hmm. So you mentioned just a couple important concepts there: expression, intention. Those two concepts, among others, of course, have been deeply entrenched in the history of aesthetic discourse and practice from the very beginning of our Western cultural tradition. So from the ancient Greeks. And we'll get a really strong sense of how that is, especially with respect to intention, over the next couple of weeks working with Plato and Aristotle, in particular Aristotle. So you mentioned that anything can be artistic insofar as it has some kind of expression. So does that mean, what do you guys think about this? And this is open to anybody. Is there something artistic, some quality or characteristic or dimension that you would call artistic that's involved in, say, science? What scientists are up to? Is there something connected there, or
I
what?
think there's definitely some art in, like, say, engineers. Whatever they create, they look at their creations. Just like if you look at, a spaceship, just, everything that we've created for astronauts to be able to go into space, that can be considered art as their creations.
Cool, cool. So creativity. And Sophia just mentioned creativity to imagine and fuel creation. So we're dealing with creation. Artists produce that which was not there before. They bring about what was previously absent, making it present. And we see that not only artists do that, engineers do it, as Michaela just mentioned. Scientists do it. People who make shoes or clothes or houses or boats do it. And this is something that we'll spend quite a bit of time unpacking in the context of Aristotle, getting a sense of the originary sense of art as poiesis. So the word poiesis might remind you of the word poetry or poetic in English. And poiesis is the word from which that word emerged historically. And it's a Greek word, which really means production. So poiesis is production. And for Aristotle, the poet who produces language, who produces words as a means of bringing about into presence what was previously absent, is in this sense the ultimate representative of all production in general. So someone who makes shoes for a living brings forth this entity we call a shoe for various uses that wasn't there before. But a poet brings forth ideas, brings forth a vision, brings forth the thematic material of the imagination in a way that nothing was there before. But unlike someone who works with shoes, there's no robust or determinate material in an external sense that's being manipulated. It's as if something comes out of nothing. And that's how language is. Of course, we have books that are preserved in libraries and bookstores and so forth, but originally poetry was precisely oral. It was in that way transitory. It came out as one's breath comes out in a mysterious way and then disappears. And this becomes emblematic for the Greeks of production at large, production in general. So in that way, we can see from the very beginning of aesthetic considerations of art and beauty and so forth, that there is something really powerfully artistic about all kinds of things that we do, and not just what we classify discretely as art or the arts. So yeah, and that brings in intention, and also expression. So someone who makes a spaceship, an engineer like that, or a bridge or something, they have an intention, that is, they have some end result that they want to realize, but often they want to do so beautifully. So someone might produce a bridge, but they also want to find a way to express themselves in that production, even if we're dealing with essentially a utilitarian artifact that allows us to carry out our everyday activities, crossing a street or a river or whatever else. There's something expressive about it too. And that expressivity lies at the heart of one's persona, one's own individual existence, as a part of creation more broadly. So that's cool. How about in room 2? So Bennett, Kala, Ava, or James. Does anybody want to share something with us?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So what we basically, we first covered some like more formal, we basically covered some more formal definitions of art, but then particularly highlighting on the creative process, but then we also looked into the emotions that are behind art as well. And also, I can't remember who, but someone quite interestingly pointed out that while art can be used, often requires the creative imagination, it can be used destructively as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Did you guys have any examples of the destructive power of art?
I said graffiti and like how it's destruction of property, and that like some people might not consider it art because it's destructive, but it is still art in some form.
Good.
What if it was being done on like the side of an abandoned building? Is that really harming anyone? I mean, it seems kind of like a generalization to say it's destructive in general.
Well, that's true, but like it's not always on abandoned buildings and things either. Restaurants, trains, all sorts of things.
Yeah, maybe.
More importantly, the act of vandalization is sort of part of the whole culture and reason for such an art form. And it's worth considering that you wouldn't really have graffiti if you were just printing out graffiti style fonts and handing them out to people, right? And as Fia just pointed out, sometimes it's hateful. Like it is fully part of a spiteful emotional moment someone had when they did that.
Yeah, so you can have like profane graffiti in which you're sort of defacing a building with slurs or something like that, in which case we wouldn't necessarily be inclined to describe it as artistic. But even in the case of beautiful graffiti, and there are fantastic graffiti artists, and of course the famous British figure Banksy, who is more or less unknown, is a part of this rich history and tradition. But even the most beautiful and sophisticated street art or graffiti, albeit destructive, albeit creative and expressive, is destructive, but that doesn't necessarily have to be negative. So even if you're dealing with an abandoned building that's been graffitied, there's something about that original structure that has been transformed or undermined, even if it's for a good intention, that is a creative or inspired intention towards beauty. Some defacement has happened. And so some theorists would claim that in this sense, as an example, destruction is itself essentially in a manner creative. So destructiveness plays along with creation in an important way. And even in literature, there's something called the palimpsest. Is anyone familiar with that term? It's like if you take a text, original piece of writing, and you obscure it or you cover it over with new writing, yet traces of the original or the old remain. So there's something destructive there. You're trying to cover over or alter what was originally expressed or given, but in that destructive relation, there's something new that comes about. So the end result is different than if you, as the artist or writer, had just used a pure neutral surface to write some text on. there's something important about those traces that remain that make it simultaneously destructive and creative. And so, yeah, that's cool. And that brings us into an interesting place to talk about morality in art, right? So some might say graffiti, insofar as it's destructive, is essentially immoral or something like that. And some might say that morality trumps aesthetic principles or criteria. But then many theorists throughout this tradition, as we'll see, say, no, we have to somehow maintain the autonomy of art. That there has to be a place open for artists to explore dangerous or disturbing ideas that might not be easily palatable or acceptable in a typical moral way. So we have to kind of tease apart the demands of ethics or morality from those of the aesthetic or of beauty. But then some would, challenge that idea and say that you can't really cleanly separate those things. Okay. So how about room 3? Michaela, Micah, Owen, and Tristan. Did anything interesting come up that you guys would like to share?
Yeah, we had a really good conversation, I think. We at first kind of explored the implication of there being things that aren't art. And the first thing that came up was science. Like, it was just kind of easy to assume that math and science aren't like inherently artistic, and that they kind of might be able to take a back seat in that regard when we're trying to define art. But as was quickly pointed out, that's not actually like technically true to say that math is an art, because as Michaela pointed out, engineers can be very proud of things they make, and as Tristan pointed out, it's just part of being a like scientist to see like the art and beauty in what you're doing. I don't recall exactly what you said, so I'm trying to summarize as quickly as possible, because we quickly moved on from that to asking what was like really essential to art beyond like distinctions of what comprises it, like math versus just paint and feelings, because they're all there. They're all part of what goes into it, but what's really important, as we kind of tried to settle on, is the fact that there's a whole process of creativity that stems from just the fact that there's a conscious agent there trying to create something. And what goes into that is just part of the whole that we call, well, there's art and there's us and there's the artistic process, and they're kind of hard to separate, honestly. And that's really all we had time to get into.
Oh, that's fine. That's cool.
I kind of want to just like add that, like, we touched on it a tiny bit, but I think it's like kind of important when I realized it, is like that there's art because of the eye of the beholder. Like, it all depends on who it is that's creating the art, who is, seeing it. It's all depend on, everyone else's, what they see as art. Because a mathematician can see, they create a whole new formula for something, that can be their art. An artist can create a painting, that can be their art. All just depends on who is beholding it.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So, good. Like with math and science, you do hear qualities espoused as something important or attractive, like elegance, for example. So a mathematician who is presenting or working through a new formula, as Michaela used as an example, will want to do so in the most elegant way possible. That is, eliminating unnecessary steps, so that it's beautiful, a mathematician might say, using that word too, in its simplicity. And so that's an aesthetic quality that we attribute to something like abstract numbers, which we can't even see, by the way, which we can't even experience. There's something aesthetic about these ideas, at least in the relations they have to each other and the structure or organization in which we put them for our own inquiry and work. And so going to Plato here, whom we'll turn to next week, principles of harmony, symmetry, proportion, those are at the heart of the beautiful, of the aesthetic, and those are mathematical, right? So if you look at harmony in terms of harmonics or composition, melody, and music, if you know music theory, you understand that there are ratios involved. There is math involved. And even looking at how to frame an image in terms of painting, how to work with a three-dimensional image or idea in a two-dimensional space involves principles of proportion and measure and so forth that are at the heart of art, but not just art, engineering, mathematics, science, all sorts of things, right? So that's a really good series of points that you guys raised there. So how about someone from room 4, Donnie, Jack, Meg, Raven? Would you guys like to share something?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about, I had shared that my kind of art is anything that kind of distract the viewer from the kind of harsh reality of life, but could also add and highlight either the harshness or the beauty of it, but very much going into it being in the eye of the beholder. And then we kind of got stuck on a quote from the reading about industry being mechanized and artists having to be more and more eccentric to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of went into that a little bit. I'm not sure if anyone else has read that part, so I didn't want to jump into it yet.
Oh, good. No, that's a really important passage. So talking
Mhm.
about politics or the economics
Mhm.
of the art world is another interesting facet or dimension of all this to touch on. So yeah, that's a good point. So there is like the shocking in art, and it's often decried as shock for shock's sake, with nothing really substantial behind it, just a sort of superficial ploy at gaining notoriety or something like that. But it can be difficult to distinguish that sort of phenomenon from legitimate art that has some real impetus behind that, whether that's the disclosure of some truth that's otherwise difficult to perceive, or expressing some heavy, even if painful or disturbing emotion or series of expressions and so forth. But yeah, it's true, as Cynthia Freeland points out, that many artists are pushed by the economic realities of an expanding global market to distinguish themselves in some ways. And so it's not just about what every individual artist is doing in terms of wanting to express themselves. There are all these other features or factors at play too that we'll have time to consider. So does anyone else have thoughts about that or anything Donnie said?
I'm curious to know more about what y'all talked about in regards to what you said first about how art is a distraction from the meaninglessness of life and the absurdity of it all. Because I do believe there's truth to that, but I want to know more about what was brought up.
So the reason why I shared that and why I wrote that, for me specifically, I am very much a student of Stoicism, and I definitely, kind of try to see life for what it is, in that, it's just a flash in the pan in the reality of what this whole human experience is, and not that everything is, minor in detail, I guess, but ultimately everybody's going to die. You can cry about it all you want, but ultimately that's kind of what we're here for. We're here to live and do something while we're here and eventually die. And art, for me, is anything that kind of can distract that. For instance, I've got chickens, right? I'm looking at my chicken coop right now. And if my kids were to plant flowers in that chicken coop to distract me from the fact that all that area is just a place for my chickens to live, breathe, and die, that is art to me, because it's kind of highlighting the simpleness of it and kind of distracting me from the outcome that's going to face everything, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the way you explained that, because there is a certain absurd quality to being alive, no matter who you are, if you're like a person or a chicken, that sort of does require some degree of distraction. And you can't ignore the prevalence of it in artistic expression either. I mean, I think the majority of things that seem artistic and like, or even just sort of colorful and meant to like grab your attention, are kind of distractive by nature. But something troubles me because not all art really is. And we're just talking about that too, right? Because there's shocking art from all eras, just really disturbing things that really raised quite the scandal, like no matter where they were, because tastes change, of course. But it makes me wonder what the point of that is in any framework, really, nihilistic or stoic or otherwise.
Yeah, that's a good point and question. So maybe we can try to re-articulate the sense that Donnie was sharing with us about art as distractive or distracting, as instead more profoundly a way of transforming our perception, giving us an opportunity to see something in a different way that we hadn't yet before. So like Donnie mentioned, if your kid puts flowers, beautiful flowers, in a bunch of shit in the chicken coop, well, that doesn't get rid of the shit. And that's something that you're still going to have to deal with at some point. Yet you're now looking at the shit in a different way because there are flowers emerging from it, and that shit contributes to the beauty of those flowers, right? So, and that's a different way to connect us to the shocking in art. The shocking can be distracting in a way. Essentially, that distraction really means literally to be pulled in more than one direction at once. So when you're distracted, your attention is drawn out in various ways, and that can be very anxiety inducing or destabilizing. Yet the shocking can do that. It can tear our attention apart from itself and push us in various ways that are in conflict, that is, various directions for our understanding and perception that don't really fit together very nicely. And that can orient our understanding and our perception to some dimensions of the world that were previously unavailable or that we didn't notice. So then shocking in the sense, and Heidegger will talk about shock. So way ahead in week 9 of this class, the German word is that he uses is Stoß. There's something about the experience of art that shakes us up and removes us from the ordinary, transports us from the ordinary, revealing what is extraordinary, even in the ordinary, which through our everyday concerns and desires and real worries and so forth, we tend to ignore for whatever reason. So good. And now let's go to room 5. So Brianna, Destry, Jackie, and Kai. Do you guys have anything? I'd like to hear something about what you guys talked about.
Yeah, we talked a bit about how there's no correct way to create or interpret art, and that everybody has a unique experience that's going to shape how they perceive something or how they conceptualize a piece of art. And because of that, what one person would consider art might not be something another considers art, and vice versa. And then we also talked a little bit about whether or not art has to have intention behind it, or that the artist has to inherently put meaning into their work for it to be considered art, or if accidents could be still considered an art form, or even something like the Fibonacci sequence, and how that doesn't have inherent meaning behind it. It's something naturally occurring, and is that still art?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so that's awesome. Great questions about intention. So we talked about intention at the very beginning, a connection to expression. Does a work of art require expression? In this case, does it require some deliberate idea in advance of the manipulative work that realizes the end result. And this is something that we'll find in the case of Aristotle that he argues quite vehemently for. Or is there a place for real accidents in art? For the aleatory. Aleatory means like surprising, accidental, it just sort of happens. So composers in the 20th century like John Cage created aleatory music, creating sort of arrangements or set up conditions through different apparatuses that would follow unpredictable patterns to give surprising experiences for those who are involved. There's no explicit intention in terms of what comes about, yet there's something creative involved, even working with accident or working with imperfections, like in Japanese aesthetics, for example, rather than looking at a crack in a piece of porcelain or in a sculpture or something as an imperfection that's problematic or regrettable, it's an opportunity for creation. So that would be incorporated. So for example, in many cases, some kind of gold material would be put in a crack to call attention to it as a crack, as an imperfection, so to speak, rather than ignoring it, right? So yeah, that's good. And also think about, for those who are familiar with like Dada, absurdism in art, and surrealism in the 20th century, Marcel Duchamp, is anyone familiar with his famous fountain? His sculpture, you could call it, called The Fountain. So this is a question. This was in the 20th century. There was an art competition in Paris, and Duchamp entered that competition by taking a toilet, a urinal, turning it on its head so that it was slightly weird looking. It wasn't obvious immediately what it was. And he said, he called it the fountain. He's like, here's a work of art. And he initially, his motivation was to present this as a kind of joke, right? He was playing with it. And it was rejected, but it caused quite a stir, and it was appropriated by other galleries later on. And then there are all sorts of copies of it created, of the fountain, throughout the decades. But the idea, and this is argued by a contemporary American philosopher of art who's now dead, but he's from the late 20th century, Arthur Danto. He argued that this is still a work of art, even though Duchamp didn't make it, right? He just took a fountain, and this is called ready-mades in art. It's still a work of art because he took it from its ordinary context in, say, a bathroom where you would go and piss in it. He took it and put it in a new context, an art world context, say a gallery or a museum. And now, because of this transformation of place, it's become a work of art. It's no longer what it was before. And so now when you enter the museum space and you see this so-called fountain, which was previously a urinal, you're brought to reconsider a toilet, for example, just an ordinary everyday object that we don't really think about. We just kind of use it. But here you're brought to a place to consider it in ways that we typically ignore it. And so that's interesting to think of, how just taking some object without it doing anything really to the object itself, introducing it to a new place or context, might, from some points of view within aesthetics, be sufficient to turn it into a work of art, to create a work of art where there wasn't one before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I was writing down, as I was writing, about how the very display of art is a ritual in itself, which can be considered art. You know, it's like you said, you know, they go in there to that place to view what they're considering to be art. And, you know, the guy puts a toilet there, and that now they have to consider that this is art as well. And, you know, so yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and there have been hilarious incidents in recent years where there's like a mop bucket somewhere in a in a museum or a gallery, and different viewers were under the impression that that was an exhibit. So they would just be like looking at it for a while or something like that. So yeah, it's very interesting to think about these things. in terms of our assumptions about what art has to be to experience it as art. Okay, cool. So are there any final things that you guys want to share from what went on in your conversation? So if not, and we can return to this when we come back, but I have some slides to work through and we'll talk about the readings. But let's take a break, just about 5 minutes or so, in case you have to use the restroom or whatever. So let's say 2:33 or so. I have 2:28 on my clock. So 2:33, we'll come back here and we'll continue. So I'll see you guys in a few minutes.